to the Lucasian Legacy podcast. My name is Garth Bruin. This is really sort of the second actual episode of the podcast. All of the content that precedes this is a reading of the text, and then one episode containing the brief biography of the author, Robert Bruin, who was my father. As this content moves forward, we're going to dig into the details of the subtopics and history of the Lucasian chair. We're going to find out more about the source material and many of the concepts that the different chairs were researching, and also the lives of other figures who are mentioned along the way within the text. This episode focuses on a person who is probably most critical to the history of the Lucasian chair, but is somewhat of a mystery. Henry Lucas, for whom the chair is named after. Now, even though the chair bears his name, and he's very much responsible for creating it, there's not a lot of information about him. And in fact, my father's book only mentions his contribution in passing and doesn't really discuss his own history. But as I said, there isn't a lot of information available about Henry Lucas. We're going to have to use what materials we have and try and get an understanding of who he was and what his intent was when he founded this chair. What the text does tell us is that in 1663, Henry Lucas, who was a member of Parliament for the university, left instructions in his will for the purchase of land that would provide an annual income for the professorship. This was sponsored by King Charles II. Now, how much money did he leave, and what was the purpose of it? So he left £1,000 for the intent of buying land. So £1,000 in 1663 is roughly the equivalent of 100,000 British pounds today. It's difficult to make accurate comparisons and equivalencies because the purchasing power of what you could buy greatly varies over time. Most people aren't buying horses and cows and chickens unless they have a farm, but this is what it would be compared to. Now, how does purchasing land go into funding a university chair? So basically, they would buy a parcel of land, it would be rented to somebody else, and that rent would be collected and used to fund the chair. Thankfully, I have in the source material a copy of the land grant and will, which, as like any other document at the time, is in Latin. Thankfully, I studied Latin in junior high school, so I can read it. Execution of his wishes are entrusted to two men, Robert Raworth and Thomas Buck. Raworth and Buck were personal friends of Henry Lucas. Raworth was Lucas's attorney, and Thomas Buck was a printer for the university, meaning he printed books, which was a specialized skill at the time. The detail about his friend and executor being the university printer leads to another important detail about Henry Lucas, in that as part of his will, he donated his library to the pending professorship. The fact that he had such a library in the 17th century meant not only that he was wealthy, but he was probably well-learned himself, and at least extremely curious. Thankfully, the University of Cambridge has preserved the entire collection that was donated by Henry Lucas. And in looking at the catalog, we can tell a little bit about his interests and how it may have helped the Lucasian chair take off. Some of the books he donated were already 100 years old. There were books in English, Latin, French, Italian. They covered history, politics, medicine. There is even a book about Stonehenge. There are several books by Aristotle, but there are two books by other scientists that help tell our story. One is a book by Galileo on Copernicus, and the other one is a collection of letters or correspondence from Descartes. What's interesting about these particular writings being in Henry Lucas's collection is that both Galileo and Descartes were relative contemporaries of Henry Lucas, meaning that they lived during the same period. For Henry Lucas to get these texts meant that he had extremely good access to the publishing world and knew of things going on in other countries, hence his connection to Thomas Buck. Both Galileo and Descartes will be covered in separate episodes of this podcast, given the importance of their contributions to the subject. Galileo, in particular, is very relevant to the early work in the Lucasian chair, especially the work done in this period that is related to Copernicus and also Kepler and Tycho Brahe. Links to the various works owned by Henry Lucas and donated to Cambridge University will be linked in the blog entry of this episode at lucasianchair.org, along with the charter sponsored by King Charles II and various documents relevant to the biography and background of Henry Lucas. Feel free to send us comments, questions through this interface at the website and also at our Instagram page, Lucasian Legacy.